On October 31, 1999, Egyptair Boeing 767 was on a scheduled flight from Los Angeles to New York and then to Cairo. There were 203 passengers and 14 crew members on board. The flight was proceeding normally. There were 2 crew shifts on board so that the pilots could change out during the flight. At 6:19 GMT, Egyptair Flight 990 took off from New York's John F. Kennedy Airport and then reached flight level 330. The flight was proceeding normally and there were no signs of trouble. At 6:50, El-Habashi, the captain, left the cockpit to go to the restroom. During this time, the second pilot was in control of the plane and was monitoring the aircraft's parameters. 30 seconds later, after the captain left the cockpit, the replacement second pilot, Pilot Ol-Batut, whispered Tawakkal to Allah, which translates as, "I rely on Allah." He repeated this phrase 7 more times. 3 seconds later, the speed of both engines was reduced to a minimum and the elevators of the aircraft were deflected into a dive. Despite the fact that the plane was diving down, and at that moment there was complete weightlessness in the plane, the aircraft commander was able to reach the cockpit. Having taken his place, he asked the second pilot what was happening, but he continued to repeat, "I rely on Allah." The commander again asked the second pilot, "What is this? Have you reduced the thrust of the engines?" Then he ordered El-Batut, "Pull after me," and the aircraft. But the second pilot continued to push the control column away from himself. The commander tried his best to raise the plane, using spoilers, but due to the overload, the plane began to disintegrate. Soon both engines failed, and 2 flight recorders turned off, at 6:52 GMT. After 53 minutes of flight, Egyptair Flight 990 crashed into the Atlantic Ocean, 100 kilometers from the island of Nantucket. A few seconds before the plane crashed into the water, its left engine broke off due to strong aerodynamic overloads. All 217 people on board died. Since the plane crash occurred in neutral waters, the authorities of Egypt and the United States took up the investigation. The whole world followed the investigation and everyone was waiting for answers. Investigators from the United States and Egypt were divided in their opinions, since the Egyptian authorities claimed that the cause of the crash was a malfunction of the aircraft, and tried in every possible way to hide the information, while investigators were sure that the crash was not accidental but deliberate. Later, during the investigation, an extremely interesting fact was revealed about the second pilot Ol-Batut. He had some mental disorders and experienced characteristic inclinations towards the hotel employees, with persecution mania. The day before the crash, Ol-Batut had an extremely unpleasant conversation with his fellow pilot, who was flying on this fatal flight, but not in the cockpit, but in the passenger seat as a vacationer. A colleague threatened Ol-Batut that he would expose him immediately upon arrival in Cairo, and that this flight would be Ol-Batut's last. The second pilot Ol-Batut decided to settle scores with his colleague, with himself, and with 216 passengers, taking advantage of the moment when the captain left the cockpit, by switching the engine throttle to idle, pointing the nose of the plane down, with an extreme angle of attack. This air crash is considered the most confusing in the history of aviation. Egyptair, as a sign of respect for the passengers and crew of Flight 990, changed the New York-Cairo flight number from 990 to 986, and now the Boeing 787 Dreamliner flies this route. In addition, Egyptair has stopped servicing Los Angeles. What do you think about this disaster? Write your opinion in the comments.